About time for us to begin our services. If you will, open your Bibles to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. We're ready for verse 2. 1 Thessalonians 3, verse 2. Let's be sure to remember those who are sick. As far as I know, they continue about the same. I try to get everybody in the bulletin, so if you'll get a bulletin, those that were sick last week, a lot of those obviously are better, but they were sick last week. But let's keep them in our thoughts and prayers. But just one sad note, Austin Hargrove's granddad passed away this morning sometime. And I don't know any of the funeral arrangements as of yet. I'm sure that I'll get that information and we'll try to get it on Facebook or whatever. And if you want to know that, then certainly you can contact me if you don't have Facebook, and I'll give you that information when I get it. I don't know that just yet. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure that he lives in or around Murfreesboro. So, at least that's what I think. His family is kind of all in that area. He lives right out. Austin and Michaela are staying right now with his mom and dad, which lives just outside of Eagleville toward Murfreesboro. So let's keep them in our thoughts and prayers as we pray. Is the speaker too loud? Is it, or is it pretty good? Is it good? Okay. Everybody back there good? Pretty good? Okay. Ray said it's all right. Okay. Good deal. We have some others coming in here. Let's give them a chance. And but if you would, we'll ask you to bow. And Charles, would you lead us in prayer, please?
Our Heavenly Father, we come to you on this day, this first day of the week, this day that has been described as the Lord's Day. And we pray that every day of our life is the Lord's Day, that we focus upon you. We have our problems, we have our difficulties, but at all times, let us understand that our purpose deed and attitude, let us that be our mission in this life. And as we study this word, don't endeavor to confirm our opinions, our preferences, but let us always endeavor to understand what you are saying and how it will make us better children of God, better reflections of the glory of your Son. May that be our goal. And Father, we do pray on behalf of the sick. What is being done by doctors, what is being done by self-care, and the prayers of the church may restore them to their health. And therefore, a thankful attitude for how precious is our health in this life, the enjoyment of life. Pray for those that are traveling, they may return to be with us. Father, be with us at all times as the world assaults us continually. May we hold up the shield of faith and be ready with the sword of the Spirit. These things we say in the name of your Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. All right, what is he talking about in the first several verses of chapter 3? Or say that. Oh, sending Timothy, okay. That is. Was he concerned about them? What was he concerned about them for? Why was he concerned?
The persecution that they were continuing
Okay.
facing.
All right. Even as they received the word, he said they'd received it in much affliction. And of course, what can that do to one's faith? What can it do to your faith in affliction? Cause you to falter? What? Well, and he was concerned about how they handled it in what way? Let me ask it that way then. Okay. Yeah, their faith might be destroyed and they might be unfaithful. It's not particularly that they might stop believing that God is. I don't think that's the case. But they might stop faithfully loving and serving him, though that could be the case as well. They had come out of idolatry. Do you think that when they came out of idolatry that they were persecuted for worshiping and serving idols? I think we need to turn around just a little bit, don't we? Yeah, Eddie, can you turn that microphone down a little bit? It's a tiny bit loud. Yeah. As I raise my voice a little bit, it gets a little loud. Is that better? Is that better? Okay. It's hard to get it adjusted. Now, maybe get it adjusted where it's really good one day again. So it just takes a little bit. But do you think that they were persecuted as they worshiped and served idols? Nobody's saying anything. No, okay. Probably not. Because the city would have been, some like the city of Athens, would have been given to idolatry. That may well have been the case, but all of a sudden now you obey the gospel, and because of your faith in Christ, all of a sudden now you're facing persecution, that you received it in much affliction. And this is one of the reasons that Paul wanted to send Timothy to them. He said, "And send Timothy, our brother and minister of God, and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and encourage you concerning your faith." And so obviously Paul was concerned about their faith. What does it mean that he wanted to send Timothy to establish them? I'm not sure what the other translations use. I forgot to write that down. What does the English Standard say, Don? Same thing? American Standard, Mike? Strengthen and encourage, okay. So he uses the word strengthen. Would that be a synonym of the ideal of to establish, to strengthen? Actually, that's how it's defined. If you look at the word establish, to strengthen or to make firm. Tropically, not so in secular authors, he says, to render constant, confirm one's mind. That's how Mr. Thayer defines the term. And so he wanted to make sure that they were strengthened in faith, that they were established in their faith, and that their faith might grow and develop. You know, Paul was very concerned about them, particularly because this is a relatively young congregation and hadn't been around very long and already facing persecution, and so he was extremely concerned about them. And this is the reason why he sends Timothy to them. Now, do we know exactly when Paul told Timothy to go to those at Thessalonica? Do we know the time? Anybody look? No, we really don't, do we? Yeah, you know, as we look and see Paul's life, and Paul and Silas, and Paul, Silas, and Timothy, obviously that Paul had received that Macedonian call, and he had gone to the city of Philippi. He had taught in the city of Philippi. You remember he had been arrested. Lydia was converted. The Philippian jailer was converted. Then he leaves there and goes to Thessalonica. And of course, as he preaches there, he reasoned with them for 3 Sabbaths, at least the Jews. It seems that he stayed there much longer, but in the synagogue, at least 3 Sabbaths. And eventually, the Jews stir up problems and troubles, and he has to flee there and go to Berea. He goes to Berea. The text in Acts 17, I think it's in about verses 5, he points out the fact that he leaves, maybe that's not, but it's in Acts 17. He leaves Silas and Timothy in the city of Berea. He goes to the city of Athens. In this particular text, it was good for him to be alone in Athens. So at least they were not with him on that occasion. It seems that he left, obviously he left Athens. He goes to the city of Corinth. And then in Acts 18 chapter in verses 5, it talks about Silas and Timothy coming to him. So we know kind of their itinerary, but then we would have to fill in some of the blanks there. And it would simply be speculation on our part. While he was in the city of Berea, he could have told Timothy, once you finish up in Berea, I want you to go back to Thessalonica. Some believes that he comes to the city of Corinth, and then he sends him back there, and then later he comes back again. We really don't know that. Some may even conclude that he came to the city of Athens for just a brief time and then went back. But once again, we don't know that. The fact of the matter is, what we do know is that he was in Berea, and then eventually he goes to Thessalonica. Silas is somewhere. Doesn't tell us that Silas was in Thessalonica. And it may be that when they come back to the city of Corinth, that Silas gets there first. And I'll show you what I mean and why I mean that in just a little bit as we look at some of these verses. But regardless of whatever it was, he compliments Timothy very highly in this verse. He said he's our brother. What is a brother? Spiritual brothers. All right. Tony? Yeah. All right, and this was. He was called his son into faith, and it may well have been that most people believe that Paul was the one that converted Timothy. And he called him his son into faith. And when he talks about his brother, he was a brother in faith. And then, of course, he talks about a minister of God. What is a minister of God? What's another term that we often use for minister? All right, can you use preacher? Did you say evangelist? Somebody did? Evangelist, okay. And sort of that could be the case. Well, what's a simpler word that we use for minister? Teacher, okay. Somebody else? Servant. That's all it is, really a servant of God. He said, and that's what he's pointing out here, a minister of God, simply a servant of God. Was he an evangelist? Yes, he was an evangelist, wasn't he? So he was a preacher and a teacher, and he was a servant of God. And Paul says our fellow laborer, he said in the gospel. And obviously that was the case. He was a fellow laborer with Paul. He worked with Paul. Paul depended upon him, I think, immensely. And it shows the confidence that I think that Paul had in this. You remember when he wrote to the Philippians, as we just got through studying not long ago, he said, I have no one like-minded that would show his care and concern for you like Timothy. Did Paul have great confidence in him when he said that? Well, yeah, he had great confidence. He knew that Timothy would do what Paul asked him to do. And actually, it would be what the Lord wanted him to do. But he was a fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ. And the reason that he sent him to him was to establish him and to encourage him concerning your faith. So he was concerned about them and their faith, if they would be and remain faithful in services to the Lord. As I said, the word encourage here, the King James uses the word comfort. It combines the ideals of exhorting and comforting and encouraging as well. So you have both ideals that's expressed when he uses the word encourage. To comfort, also to encourage as well. Did they need to be comforted? Did they need to be encouraged? Yes. Do all of us need that? Yes. You know, there's not a single one of us that doesn't need that at some time or at some point. Does life sometimes weigh on you heavily because of some of the things that you face in life? Yeah, it can be. It can be very exhausting and very trying. Charles, you had something?
Well, when I was reading this, what came to my mind was a central coastal town in California called Morro Bay.
Mm-hmm.
South of the rock is a huge jetty, and the jetty protects the harbor from the waves. If the jetty wasn't there, it would be overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Waves are constantly hitting against the jetty, but I've seen during storms spray 30 feet in the air from it. And I was just thinking that jetty, each member is a stone in that jetty, and the world is constantly buffeting against us. Every once in a while, there's massive storms that just can overwhelm us. But that's why we have elders and deacons and preachers and teachers, and that's why we have one another.
Yep.
Is to keep us shored up, is to keep us in good repair, so we don't break.
Yeah, that's exactly what he's doing, and the reason that he's sending Timothy here. You know, they may have questioned the fact of whether or not Paul really loved them and cared for them. If he cared for them, they may have said something like, well, would he have left? And then the second thing that they may have said, well, why hadn't he returned if he really cares about you? And so that may have been some thoughts that they brought, or some charges that they may have leveled against Paul. But let me ask you this. Would Paul take the time to send Timothy there if he didn't love them? Would he even care if he didn't love them? You know, once you get away from a place, I'm just glad to get away from here. I don't have anything else to do with those brethren. And, I don't, if they're faithful, okay. If they're not, they're okay. That wasn't Paul's attitude at all, was it? Paul was extremely concerned about them. Yes, he had to flee because of persecution, and Satan had hindered him from returning, whatever that was and whatever that was involved in that. But he does love them, he cares for them, he prays for them, he sends Timothy to them, and eventually he wants to go there himself. He wants to see them, and that's one of the things that he says in this text. And the reason being, much like what Charles was talking about there, is so that they might be established and so that they might be encouraged, strengthened, edified, built up, and so that they might remain strong in the Lord. You know, Paul, when Timothy comes to Paul, does he bring him good news about how they had received the suffering and that they were facing? Well, yeah, if you look in the next few verses, you know, Paul is very much encouraged because of their stand and because their faith has not been shaken, because they are faithful and loyal. And so he's encouraged by that. All right, any thoughts about verse 2? Yeah, Dalton? Mm-hmm.
This is just a thought that's come to me in regard to the idea of, we may look at it and say, Paul is dealing on persecution so much in regard to this. The people that he sent letters to, where he preached,
Mm-hmm.
until I got to thinking about it. When you recognize the strength and the power of the devil as he uses sin,
Mm-hmm.
you go back to the Garden of Eden. You find out that there was no pressure on Eve whatsoever in regard to the evil that she engaged in eating the tree she wasn't supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't any pressure. It wasn't anything that was written. So we see how easily the devil can tempt us
Yeah.
without any great persecution. We start, if we don't watch, we'll look at the fact, well, persecution is some of this terrible thing that comes that takes it away from us. These temptations is something that is a lot of pressure put upon us. Well, in many instances, the devil doesn't have to put any pressure. All he has to do is make a suggestion, because that's all he did there in the Garden of Eden with Eve, was make a suggestion. And it didn't take her but just a short period of a moment or two to decide to go with him.
Well, temptations come in three forms, obviously. It's the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And any one of those things Satan can use against us. And as I said, it's not like that he's twisting our arm and making us do it. But the temptation is placed before us, and if we're not strong enough in the faith, then we'll yield to that temptation. And that's what Paul is concerned about these. Though the temptation that they face would have been stronger, because they were suffering persecution. And Satan would be the one that would be behind that. And so in this instance, we can see that Satan can use any of these things to his advantage to get people to lose their faith. You know, Peter describes him as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And he will devour us if we allow that. And so we have to make sure that we don't allow that. And I like the point that you made, that's just like in the Garden of Eden. The temptation, part of that temptation was, God knows when you do this. In other words, Satan questioned the motive of God. And how sad that was, but she yielded to that temptation. But before we condemned Adam and Eve, put yourself in that position. We might have done a lot worse than what they did. So, yeah, it's pretty easy for us to say I wouldn't have done that. But hey, no, if we'd have been there, we might have done a whole lot worse. So, but all of us yield. All of us commit sin from time to time, for which we have to receive forgiveness. As the old saying is that we don't know what another man's going through until we walk in his shoes. And so I think that's the case of what some people go through and the difficulties that they face. Good thoughts. All right, any other thoughts about verse 2? Look at verse 3. He said that no one should be shaken by these afflictions, for you yourselves know that we are appointed to this. Could these afflictions shake their faith? Well, yeah, shake their faith. Was he concerned about them becoming unfaithful? Was he concerned about them committing apostasy? Now, what does that do to the doctrine of once saved, always? Does that pretty well destroy that thought? You know, these verses pretty well destroy that. You know, usually these are not verses, though, that are used. I've got numbers of debate books in my library, and these verses are not too much the ones that are used sometimes in a debate in defending the truth against the ideal of once saved, always saved. You know, might use Hebrews 3 and verses 12 and Hebrews 4 verses 1 and some other passages just like that. You know, but these verses are good verses as well to teach the truth about this and to expose the error of this ideal that once I've been saved, I'll always be saved. And there's nothing that can shake my faith to the degree that it can cause me to lose my soul. If that was the case, then why would Paul waste his time sending Timothy to the city of Thessalonica? Why would he do that? Why would Timothy waste his time going if that couldn't happen? Well, it could happen, and that's exactly what Paul is saying. But he wanted to make sure that no one would be shaken by these afflictions. I don't want you to be shaken. To agitate, to disturb, and trouble is the idea behind shaking. And it could shake one's faith, obviously. That's the reason why he's sending them there, to establish and encourage them in their faith, and so that they might not be shaken. You know, the parable of the seed or the sower, deals with that very thing. When the seed is sown in the hearts of individuals, and then persecution arises, and then they're no longer faithful and no longer loyal. And so Paul understood that. He knew that. Now notice this. He said, "For you yourselves know that we're appointed to this." What does he mean by that? All right, going to be persecuted. Okay. What about us? Does he warn us as well? Are there several verses that warn us about persecution and suffering? Well, what's one of your favorite verses to look at to prove that? What's a verse that you usually use? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So 2 Timothy 3 and verses 12 is where Paul writes to young evangelists, says all of the
Godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution.
And
so he warns us that.
And so he warns
even
us
in the
that.
Sermon on the Mount.
Even in the Sermon on the Mount, remember.
Part of what you were talking about.
Part of what you were talking about. Some other verses as well.
He warned us.
He warned us. For instance, in verses 10 through verses 12 of Matthew 5.
He said, "Blessed are those that are
persecuted."
So he understood that persecution.
So he understood that persecution.
He was persecuted.
He was persecuted.
Much like what Tony had just said.
What Tony had just said.
The fact of the matter was, if he suffered persecution, then if we love him and serve him, we're going to suffer the same fate. Now, maybe not to the same degree that they suffered in New Testament times. Paul, he talked about he had this long list of everything that he went through. How he was shipwrecked, stoned, left for dead, just numbers of great things that he faced. And you and I, we just never have faced that kind of persecution. So we may be persecuted a little bit, but it's mild in comparison to those during New Testament times. But there are any number of passages that teach us that. As I said, Matthew 5 verses 10 through 12, Luke 6 verses 22, John 16:2, 2 Timothy 3 verses 12, 1 Peter 5 verses 9, or just some of the verses that are scattered through the New Testament that this is the fate of those that believe. Now I find it interesting when we're studying with people, and we're trying to teach them the gospel, and we're trying to get them to obey the gospel. Do we take the time to point out to them, if you obey the gospel, now understand, to eliminate all your problems, but it might increase the problems that you have, and the persecution that you might endure? Do we share that with them? Do we warn them about that? There will be. Should we? I think that we fail sometimes if we don't point that out. This doesn't eliminate problems simply because you obey the gospel. It eliminates your spiritual problem. It eliminates the fact that you can lose your soul. It eliminates that. But as far as physical persecution, as far as financial problems, if one had financial problems, or whatever the case may be, or family problems, or any of those things, that doesn't eliminate those kind of things. You're still going to be faced with those things, and you're still going to be tested and tried, and you're still going to have to remain faithful and loyal. And so we need to warn people about that. Tony? Oh no. And I think one of the things too that we need to do is
we need
to do the things that will help us to be strong when persecution does come, that our faith is sufficiently strong enough that we can endure those things. You know, that's the reason why we need to spend time in worshiping, study, and prayer, and all those kind of things, so that we can be strong. It's like putting on the whole armor of God. This comes to my mind. I was asked to write an article about putting on the armor of God for a magazine. But anyway, and I couldn't help but think, as I've been thinking about that. You know, the armor is given to us by God. You know, that's a great thing. That's a great thing that we can see. And all that pieces of that armor is given to us. But now, who is it that has to put it on? Does he put it on for us? Or do we have to put it on? But now, how do we put it on? You know, that's the question I think all of us need to answer. You know, God supplies it for us. He talks about the wiles of the devil. There's going to be a lot of temptations that we face concerning Satan and how he tempts us. But I think he also gives us some instructions, not in that particular place where he talks about putting on the armor of God. I don't think he tells us exactly how to do it in that particular verse. But there are other verses that tell us exactly how to clothe ourselves. You know, clothe ourselves with righteousness, study and pray and do all those things so that we can stand when temptation does arise. So that's the thing that he wants us obviously to do. So if we'll do these things and arm ourselves, put on the armor of God before those temptations, then certainly we can be strong enough to stand and not yield to those temptations or to the wiles of Satan. Any other thoughts about this? Any other thoughts about this, Charles? Well, it's just like parents warning children as you grow up. There are going to be problems and difficulties you're going to face in life as a result of just growing up and becoming adults. You know, you're going to face problems at work. You know, in the world, and things. And I think that's the same thing that God is doing with us. God is doing with us, and Christ is doing with us. He understood what's going to happen as a result of their faith, because it would be faith. And because, just like you said, the world hated him. It's going to hate us when we stand for what's right. And when we defend the truth, when you start defending the truth against people that don't believe and accept the truth, then a lot of times you're going to suffer persecution as a result of it. It doesn't mean that we like it, that we enjoy it, but you know, we have to stand for what's right, do what's right, and of course, as a result of doing that, many times there's opposition because of that. But yet we have to be, and it's a good thought. I think it obviously warns us about that. Any other thoughts? Michael? Yeah. Well, yeah, like you said, trials, you know, as you go through life and as you face trials and stuff, it has good benefits. It produces patience, as he says, or endurance. It removes defiling things, and it genders within us, you know, righteous and good things, and all those kind of things. You know, sometimes facing trials, does it cause you to be more humble when you're facing those trials? Does it gender humility in our lives? To realize that, hey, we need the Lord, and we need, yeah, it has good characteristics, or produces good characteristics in our lives. And so, yeah, good. And all, like you said, all relations. A relationship that's over relationship, but we're close with each other and obviously with God. Joe? Yeah. Yeah. Sure it does. Yeah. Well, I had a good friend one time. His mother died. He'd never been married. He'd stayed with his mother. He'd taken care of his mother. His mother died, and I went to the funeral home to visit with him when his mother passed, and trying to do all I could to encourage him. And something came up about Job in this, and of course, I pointed out the fact. Look at everything that Job endured. Look how God was with him, and Job conquered and overcome. And right at the moment, he just kind of blurted out to me. He said, I don't even think Job was a real character. Now, this man obviously was very troubled at that time. Well, I didn't sit there and try to argue with him over that. What good would that have done? It wouldn't have done a bit of good. Later, he came back around and he understood that. He saw that. But right at the moment, just at that time, he was extremely disturbed and distraught because of what happened to him in his life. He's preaching this day, right now. So, he overcame that. So, are they difficult moments? Yeah, absolutely. Are there moments that try our faith? Oh, sure it is. And of course, I think this is what Paul was concerned about them, is their faith, and if their faith would be sufficiently strong to endure these afflictions. And so there are a lot of afflictions that we go through in life. And sometimes we don't always understand, why me? And but sometimes, why not me? That might produce something good in my life as a result of maybe the suffering that one was going through, might draw us closer to each other, closer to God, might remove defiling things from our lives, and gender righteous and good things in our lives as well. So, all right, any other thoughts? And a lot of this is, do we always have good answers to every question that arises? I wish I could say that I did, but I've had people ask me sometimes that I don't have a clue. Why am I going through that? Well, I don't really know. We just have to trust the Lord and be faithful to Him, and knowing that if we're faithful, then everything will be okay. So that's for sure. All right. Any other thoughts? Look at verse 4. He said, "For in fact, we told you before when we were with you that we would suffer tribulations, just as it happened, and you know." So that it's kind of interesting. Did Paul tell them that they would have to suffer? Yeah, he told them that. I think this is a good example for us, that when we're studying with people, and when they're getting close to render obedience to the gospel, and maybe when they want to obey the gospel, that we explain to them now, everything in life is not going to be perfect now, that you're still going to face troubles and trials. You may still suffer because of your faith. And I think Paul was warning them concerning this. Now, had he experienced that there? Had he experienced that firsthand? Well, over and over he'd experienced that. And he experienced that in Thessalonica. Did those Thessalonians that obeyed the gospel, did they see what Paul went through? Well, yeah, they saw exactly what Paul went through. But now, as the result of them receiving the word, were they experiencing that as well? Well, yeah, they were experiencing that as well. So they saw Paul go through that. Paul had taught them that they would go through that. They were experiencing that. Paul knew that they were experiencing that, and this is the reason that he sends Timothy to them, so that they might not be shaken in the faith. That's one thing that all of us need to understand, and that is the fact the world, and that we're to go. Turn with me to 1 Peter 4 and look at verses 12. 1 Peter 4, verse 12. You can put this down with those other verses that I mentioned just a moment ago if you want to. Somebody read verse 12 for us. 1 Peter 4, verse 12. All right. So now in this particular verse, Paul says, don't think it's strange, but you're going to go through these difficult moments in life. Peter does. I may have said Paul. Peter points that out to them. Now, if you go on down, there's several other things that he says, but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's suffering. Did Christ suffer? Yeah, he suffered. Are we going to suffer as a result of being followers of Christ? Well, yeah, that's exactly what's going to happen. And when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. So there's something that's coming after we suffer for a while here on earth. If we're faithful, if we're loyal to God, then heaven can be our home where we don't have to experience those kind of things any longer. But to be forewarned is to be forearmed. Isn't that what we all say? We understand that this is coming at some time or at some point. We just don't know sometimes the degree of persecution. Let me ask you this. Have you ever suffered any kind of persecution as a result of being a Christian? To any degree? Have you ever been made fun of, ridiculed? You know, if you've ever stood for what's right, do people ridicule you because you're standing for what's right? You're standing against something? You know, in society today, what are we called as a result of standing against some of the sins that are going on in the world today? How do people look at us? What do they think about us? What do they think about you? Do they like you because of what you're standing for? Or do they sometimes despise you? Do they have evil things to say about you? If they could probably persecute you, literally, or to cause you to suffer physically, maybe that's a better way to say it. You think they would do that if they could do that? Get away with it? Probably. But in this country, they're not permitted to do that. But yet that's exactly what has happened. And so don't think it's strange, because those things are going to happen to us. All right, any thoughts? Charles? Well, one of the guys that we support back here, William Stewart on the board, he and Shelley could not have children, and they tried to adopt in Canada for years and years and years. Canada would not allow them to adopt a child if they said that they would ever spank that child. And they asked him specifically. Now, William, being a Christian and being a servant of the Lord, he and Shelley, now how did they answer when they asked, would you spank your child? What did they have to say? They'd have to say yes. Yeah, we will do that. Well, when they did that, that ended it right there. It stopped. It stopped right there. They could not adopt children in Canada because of that. Thankful that the Prime Minister and various lawmakers at that time, there was another adoption agency there, that finally they were able to adopt a little girl, and they've had her for several years now. Her name is Linda. She just celebrated her 9th or 10th birthday. I forget now which it was. She's an absolutely adorable child. And they were able to finally adopt. And so thankful that was the case. But yeah, that's a form of persecution that one has to endure as a result of being a child of God. William and Shelley wanted children in the worst kind of way, and but never could do that. I'm thankful that it wasn't that way here. When we adopted Marshall, we didn't. That was not in consideration. So, and I'm thankful for that. And, of course, now sacred selections they help parents get lots of kids, and so sacred selections is a really good thing. It's an organization that's run by Christians. Churches are not involved in it, simply just Christians. And so they have fundraisers so that people can adopt children. numbers of children have been adopted. I know several that have been adopted through sacred selection, which is a good thing. All right, any other thoughts? Dalton, I'm sorry. You have to yell at me sometimes. I don't always look. I said, you have to yell at me sometimes. I don't always look. See. You're right. Yeah. Yep. You know, I'm working on the 41st, 42nd year of preaching. And during that time that I've been preaching, the greatest persecution that I've ever faced is from my brethren. And I dare say that most preachers probably could say that. Much of the opposition that you're going to face will be among your own brethren. And I try to put those things out of my mind because that's minute in comparison to the good that the brethren have done for me through the years and for my family, and how much encouragement that I've received from them. But there's always that small percentage, and it hurts. It hurts, and it's very disappointing. But I try to look at the opposite of that and see all the good that brethren do and how they encourage me. There was some that texted me last Sunday night, I think it was. Maybe Wednesday, I don't know. I lose track of time. But how encouraging it is sometimes that what people say and how they lift you up and how they encourage you. You know, then you have a few, though. You have that just few. Boy, they would destroy your faith in a heartbeat if you'd let them, but we can't afford to let that happen. Yeah, so it's not just on the outside, it's not just in the world, but it's even among those who are Christians. But that's for sure. So, but that's part of the things that we have to deal with. Acts 20 was the verse that you were talking about there when Paul was talking to the elders. He said, even from among yourselves, men shall arise, speaking, as you said, perverse things to draw away disciples after them. And he warned them concerning that. And they did that, and we can see that. That's part of what Paul is even warning these Thessalonians about. You know, some are not going to work, and of course he tells them to note them, and you know, they need to be busy working and not busybodies and idles, and sitting around idle doing nothing. So yeah, he warns them concerning that. All right, any other thoughts? I'll look at verse 5. He said, for this reason, when I could no longer endure it, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter had tempted you, and our labor might be in vain. Now look at that for just a moment. Go back to verses 1 as well. Look at verse 1. Therefore, when we could no longer endure it. And then look at verse 5. When I could no longer endure it. It says that twice in this text. What does it mean? All right, very, very concerned about it? I got you. Well, he means the same thing in both places, obviously. But to me, I mean, he mentions it twice. And so it was something that was very troubling to him that he really wanted to know. You ever been that way? You just couldn't hardly wait to find out, what's going on? You ever be anxious about your children or whatever the case, and you're walking the floor, you're waiting for them to come in, they're not on time, and you're extremely anxious. Well, what's going on and stuff, you know? And when they finally come in, are you relieved? You glad to know that they're okay? Yeah, you know, that's quite a relief, isn't it? And so Paul was kind of that way, I think, with these brethren at Thessalonica. He was very concerned about them. He wanted to know about their faith, and if they were able to endure the persecution, that he knew that they were that they were facing. He knew what they were going to face. He knew what they were going to be dealing with because he had dealt with it while he was there. He had to leave the city because of that. He knew that they had received the word in much affliction, as he writes in this letter. He knew all those things, and that's the reason why he sends Timothy to them. He wants to know. He says, when I could no longer endure, then I wanted to know. Endure, to hold out, forbear, or to bear with endure is how the term itself is defined. He said, I wanted to know your faith. Now, how does he use the word faith here? Is there another word that we might use that would convey the ideal maybe a little better than faith? All right. Convicted. Okay. Any others? Endurance. Okay. Steadfast. Yep. Their faithfulness. And which involved their faith. It involved their personal faith, didn't it? It involved their subjective faith. But was their faith strong enough that they would endure and remain faithful and loyal? That seems to be the ideal. He said, lest by some means the tempter. Now, who's the tempter? Would be Satan himself. Okay. It's kind of interesting, this word tempter and tempted here. It's the exact same Greek word. I found that kind of interesting. I was kind of, wow, that's pretty amazing. But so I looked up the definition of it. Here's the definition that Thayer gives it. It's kind of a two-part definition a little bit. He says to try or test one's faith or virtue, character, by enticement to sin. Is Satan trying to entice us to sin? Yeah, that's exactly what he's trying to do. What if we practice sin as a way of life? What will happen to us? Has he succeeded? Well, yeah, he's succeeded. He's destroyed our soul. And then he said, hence, according to the context, equivalent to solicit to sin, to tempt. Then he says, of the temptation of the devil. And so when he talks about here, the tempter, which would be Satan, and tempt us, he's trying to entice us to sin that we might lose our soul. Now, when he says that our labor might not be in vain, what does he mean by that? Yeah, the work that he had done, what's it accomplished? Hey, have you ever worked hard to try to teach somebody the gospel of Jesus Christ, make obedience to the gospel, and then have gone unfaithful? Was your labor in vain? Well, maybe to some degree, at least. But at least you gave them the opportunity to hear. Now, what a person does with that, it's left up to them. But Paul didn't want his work to be in vain among them. Metaphorically, of endeavor, labors, acts which result in nothing, vain and fruitless. He didn't want them to be destroyed, that his efforts were fruitful. But I think not just from his standpoint, but from their standpoint as well, because he wanted them to save their by the grace of God. All right, any thoughts? All right, we'll stop there. Was the microphone a little better there? Did everybody hear okay? Wasn't too loud. Started cutting out. Okay.
Well, that's good, man.